S- Okay. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the USGCRP Integrated Observations Interagency Working Group Seminar for 2024. My name is Anna Connor, and I'm the coordinator for the Observations Working Group, where I work alongside our co-chairs, Diane Stanitsky, Deputy Director of NOAA's Pacific Marine Environmental Lab, and Barry Leffer, Rotational Deputy Associate Director of Research at NASA. So today's seminar, Terrestrial GHGs, fits within a series entitled Becoming a Climate-Ready Nation, a focus on greenhouse gases. Many of the seminars in this series are co-sponsored by the Carbon Cycle Interagency Working Group, and we appreciate their partnership. This series highlights many of today's pressing climate topics related to greenhouse gases that can only be addressed using high-quality Earth observations and completed with the help of strong cross-agency partnerships. The series is intended to highlight the influence of GHG observations on everything from the atmosphere, ocean, and land to the cryosphere and human health, all within the context of an integrated system with the goal to complete a global stocktake every 5 years. So our first speaker today is Dr. Kevin Kroeger. Dr. Kroeger is a coastal biogeochemist at the Woods Hole, Massachusetts office of the U.S. Geological Survey's Coastal and Marine Hazards and Resources Program. He leads research on carbon cycle and GHG processes in tidal wetland environments and evaluates opportunities in climate change mitigation through improved management and policy. So, Kevin, whenever you're ready, you can share your screen and go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And thanks for the invitation to speak. And I'll see if I can find my slides. Why am I not seeing them? Um, ah, this might be it.
That looks good. Yeah. Thanks, Kevin.
Right, great. Okay, so I'll just very briefly start out by talking about USGS wetland carbon and greenhouse gas science a little bit more broadly. We're a bureau of the Department of Interior, and the Department of Interior includes a number of bureaus with land management and water management responsibilities. And one of our key missions is to provide science for those land management bureaus. Collectively, the Department of Interior manages about 20% of U.S. Land and water, and about 15% or so of wetlands in the United States. And increasingly, of course, there's interest in what the effects of management decisions are on carbon and greenhouse gas processes. And so although USGS has been doing carbon cycle science for a long time in wetlands distributed widely across the country and internationally, that kind of work and that focus is increasing. And some of the the programs that we have are in geospatial science, including things like Landsat program in collaboration with NASA, and LCD land cover database, the 3DEP national elevation database. Shoot, I'm trying to hide. Sorry.
Oh, we can't see
I,
that.
oh,
We
yeah,
see
did I? Ah, gosh.
we just
I
see the
wanted to,
slides.
how did I do that? Um, I don't know what's happening here. I tried to move the view of people out of the way and
We we're not seeing the view of people though, so
okay.
it might be distracting for you, but we just see your slide with no interference.
Okay. I'm terribly sorry, but I don't know where I can see my screen now. Oh,
Okay.
there it is. Okay, I found it again.
All right.
Okay. So does it look okay now?
Yeah, looks great.
Okay. And we have quite a lot of field research coupled with analytical laboratories across the United States. And I would suggest that biogeochemical expertise is a strength for the Bureau. I'm in some kind of a strange mode now, and advancing slides is not
Do you want to
happening
stop
normally.
sharing and maybe reshare again?
Yeah. Okay. Okay.
Yeah, that looks good. And that
Okay.
worked. Perfect.
Okay. Great. So the title of my presentation is Lateral Export and Anthropogenic Methane as Key Features for Blue Carbon Management. And I'm going to talk about the methane first. Um, so, an overview of carbon and greenhouse gas processes in tidal wetlands. We're talking about here salt marshes, uh, tidal forests, including mangroves and also seagrasses. But the most of what I'll be talking about is in salt marshes, but it's relevant for those other ecosystems as well. And these ecosystems take up CO2 from the atmosphere at a rapid rate. Because they're a wetland, they tend to store carbon at a rapid rate in the soil and sometimes in biomass as well. Um, Opportunities for management of carbon include management of a healthy condition for the ecosystem, so they retain their soil carbon stocks and continue to accumulate more. Um, if they're in degraded condition, they can become sources of CO2 or methane to the atmosphere. And so restoring ecosystems can reduce those emissions. And more recently, we're finding that the lateral flux of carbon from these ecosystems to the coastal ocean is quite a large flux. And we're looking at whether there's carbon sequestration associated with that. Um, so coastal wetlands store carbon at a rapid rate. The net CO2 sink in about 38,000 square kilometers in the conterminous US is about 86 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents in the next 10 years. When wetlands are disturbed or impounded or drained, they can become high density sources for those greenhouse gases. We've estimated, along with colleagues, that about 40% of potential U.S. tidal wetland areas in a degraded condition. And so that represents an important opportunity for avoided emissions and enhanced sink. Um, Annual methane management opportunity is not well constrained. We've estimated in the range of about 1 to 12 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalents per year. Those emissions are not yet inventoried in the EPA inventory. Um, and as I mentioned, they export a majority of their NEE to the ocean. The magnitude of ocean storage of that flux is not yet well assessed or inventoried. So, what are the processes that lead to emissions of CO2 or methane in degraded condition? Under natural conditions in response to sea level rise, a tidal wetland will gain soil carbon in the range of, say, 200 or so grams of carbon per meter squared per year. And they'll have a certain resilience to sea level rise because of their ability to gain elevation over time. If we impound them, if we put a structure across the tidal channel that connects the wetland to the coastal ocean, and we don't enable enough drainage off of that ecosystem, we'll tend to retain freshwater drainage off of the landscape, and it will convert towards a freshwater wetland or water body. Um, Saline tidal wetlands tend to be minor sources of methane to the atmosphere because seawater has a very high concentration of sulfate. Sulfate reduction is a more energetically favorable metabolic pathway for breakdown of organic matter than methanogenesis, and so tends to inhibit methanogenesis, and it can also provide an electron acceptor for the oxidation of methane, so it'll inhibit emission. If we block that tidal flow, we block the supply of sulfate, they tend to become a larger source for methane. Uh, a better known process management condition of wetlands is drainage. That's something we've been doing for a long time across the world. And when we do that, we expose soil carbon stocks to oxygen and we enhance CO2 emission. And Sheel's going to be talking more about that process in a few minutes. In this bottom left graph, what I'm indicating here is that although these ecosystems are a strong sink for CO2 from the atmosphere, stronger than typical forests, for instance, um, the opportunity to reduce methane emissions or CO2 emissions from these degraded conditions through restoration is much stronger in terms of radiative forcing. And we've tested this hypothesis in a number of locations using eddy covariance techniques and also gas flux chambers. And what we find is that although an impounded wetland may be invaded by a very productive species of wetland grass called Phragmites, and that Phragmites does store a lot of carbon in the soil, the enhanced methane emissions under this degraded condition result in a net substantial net benefit to restoring tidal flow to these ecosystems. Working with the Smithsonian Institution, we've engaged in efforts to map these impounded and degraded wetlands across the United States. They're very widely distributed. As you can see, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service manages more of these conditions than any other entity. The state of Louisiana manages quite a lot. We think we're still not capturing a lot of the impoundments behind transportation infrastructure, and so this work is continuing. Working with the University of Connecticut, we've developed a new Landsat-based remote sensing product that's provided us with new maps of wetland distribution, tidal wetland distribution across the United States for each year between 1986 and 2023. And it with something called a tidal regressor, we can detect whether a wetland is tidal or non-tidal. And so this opens the opportunity for identifying these management conditions more accurately and monitoring the greenhouse gas emissions associated. And so the second topic I'm going to talk about is this lateral flux export and a particular focus on alkalinity. So we're talking about inorganic carbon due to respiration and its fate in the coastal ocean. So it turns out that about 3/4, although it's variable across space, of the net CO2 uptake from the atmosphere in these tidal wetland ecosystems is exported to the coastal ocean. And so it's very important to understand this lateral flux, not just in terms of what the fate is of the flux itself, but also because our gas flux measurements in these settings will not be an accurate reflection of the net rate of carbon storage in the ecosystem. And so we need to couple lateral fluxes with eddy covariance and other methods for monitoring greenhouse gases. So a couple of pathways that lead to this export. One of them is aerobic respiration, generating carbon dioxide. The other is anaerobic respiration, primarily sulfate reduction. That generates bicarbonate, which is a form of alkalinity. So that's HCO3 minus. The residence time or the turnover time of bicarbonate in the ocean is about 100,000 years. And so there's potential for very long sequestration of this portion of the carbon uptake from the atmosphere in the ocean. Yeah. So we developed, working with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, USGS developed a new method for measuring this flux. And we don't just measure it, we can get observations, instantaneous fluxes on the time scale of minutes, but we can monitor the flux for years by deploying sensors and doing very careful water budget analysis. And so this provides us with data like shown in this graph. And if we integrate that over time, then we have much, much better observations of this flux than have been available in the past. So to account for the lateral flux, we need to be able to measure it reliably. We can use those measurements to understand the primary controls, develop the ability to model the flux, something we're working on in this NASA CMS project. And we need to understand the long-term storage in the ocean as well. So by integrating those fluxes over multiple years, we can start to see patterns in which we see that the most productive season with high biological production rates through respiration and detritus production and root exudation of dissolved organic carbon, fluxes are highest in the warmer season. We can also see this metric here called Z star is an indication of the elevation of the marsh platform relative to the tide range. And what we see is that the export is larger where there is more frequent and deeper inundation of the soil in the tides. So there's a hydrodynamic control and a biological control as well. We have a national scale model from the Smithsonian Institution and USGS of the tidal elevation, salt marsh elevation relative to tides. And this will help us with the effort to model this at a higher resolution spatially. And so in the CMS project, we have quite a large team, and we have a series of 6 tasks. The first one is to synthesize flux data that's used to this same method or very similar to method to what we developed. And that's been applied now at approaching about 20 locations around the country. We'll develop a model to predict that flux across space and time. We'll use we'll use a couple of different approaches to observe and also model the fate of this carbon in the coastal ocean. And there, what we're doing is determining the change in CO2 exchange between the atmosphere and the estuary and coastal ocean in response to the presence or absence of tidal wetland exports. And we'll use this decode model that I mentioned before and the blue carbon maps of management condition to guide implementation of the model. And then our end users are the EPA greenhouse gas inventory. They're very interested in whether this is potentially a inventoriable and creditable carbon sequestration pathway. And that's it for me. I hope I didn't go too long.
Right on time.
Oh, good.
Okay. Anna, could you introduce Sheel?
Yep. So our next speaker is Dr. Sheel Bansal, who is a research ecologist with the U.S. Geological Survey in Jamestown, North Dakota. His research focuses on unraveling the mechanisms that drive carbon cycling and greenhouse gas fluxes in wetlands. A primary emphasis of his lab is on methane emissions from wetlands in the prairie pothole region. So, Sheel, you can start whenever.
You see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Still seeing the screen or my notes?
We're seeing the screen, so it's good. You're good to go.
Awesome. Well, hey, thanks for having me here to talk to you guys today. I'm going to be telling you about a study on methane, very powerful greenhouse gas. As you heard, it contributes about 25% towards climate warming. But microbes have been producing methane in wetlands for millions of years, and we haven't had climate warming. And it's because there's a natural breakdown process in the atmosphere that's kept methane concentrations in check at less than 0.0001%. So wetland methane has been providing warmth, even essential warmth, but not causing warming. It's like putting on a blanket on a cool night, keeps us comfortable. Yeah, but now humans with our cow farts and our gas leaks and our garbage, we are emitting way more methane than that natural breakdown process can handle. which is kind of like adding on a second blanket. We're actually well into our third blanket. So one point I want to make here is that this, pre-industrial baseline methane that was coming from wetlands isn't causing warming. It's the additional human methane that's causing warming. But we're going to revisit this at the end of my talk. So thank you to all my co-authors on this study that went on in the prairie pothole region, or PPR. Like the title says, it's the largest wetland complex in North America, 10th largest in the world, and it provides a number of ecosystem services. And we asked ourselves a simple question: how much methane is coming in and out of this ecosystem, both in the past and in the future? And on our way to learning these answers, we learned a lot of things about farm to global scale methane mitigation. So for any study, you need a lot of data. One way to measure methane flux is through the chamber method, which is kind of like a paint can. You flip it upside down, you put it on the ground, or you float it on water. We measure the accumulation of gases over time. We do this in multiple time points and multiple locations in each wetland. And then we did it in almost 200 wetlands over 200,000 square kilometers over 13 years, giving us, nearly 20,000 flux measurements that we used for modeling, which is a great place to start for any modeling exercise, and also one of the largest data sets in the world of its kind by a lot. So we first looked at what were the common drivers of methane, and we did find that, conditions that are wetter, warmer, more vegetation, those are conditions that lead to higher methane emissions. And this is true for wetlands around the world. But we also saw this interesting relationship with area, where these kind of medium-sized wetlands, maybe 3 or 4 football fields in size, they were essentially super emitters compared to their kind of smaller or larger counterparts. And when we scale to the landscape, we realized they're only 10% of the area to cover almost half of all methane emissions. And this has a lot of implications in the way we manage wetlands in the prairie pothole region, where a farm field will typically have, many small, low methane emitting wetlands that are then drained and consolidated into one medium-sized super emitter. So this is the way that wetland drainage can actually lead to increased methane emissions. But the opposite should be true as well with wetland restoration. So this is really where those farm scale implications come in from our findings. Now, once we knew all the drivers of methane, we mapped them across the landscape using satellite imagery, mostly Landsat, at the 30-meter resolution. And when we went to predict flux down at this 1 kilometer resolution, or this still at 30-meter resolution, but looking down at 1 square kilometer, we could see a huge amount of variation from record low to record high and everything in between. We also, know much more about which wetlands we would want to preserve or conserve when it comes to wetland management. So I just want you to imagine if we had decided to run the model at the 1 kilometer level, how much valuable information would we have missed? We zoomed out to the 10 kilometer level. So this is getting towards where global models typically predict at, or larger. And global models typically estimate methane flux for a pixel and then multiply it by the fraction of water. But we're showing that you could have the same amount of water, but very different methane emissions, just depending on how many super emitters you have in your neighborhood. And then we zoomed way out to the prairie pothole region, almost 1 million square kilometers. And now we could start seeing, patterns around environmental gradients or places where there's been excessive wetland management. So this is where, some of the larger scale climate change policy implications come in. And I will say we ran scenarios in the past and into the future, and we did hit that 1 trillion prediction mark or I should say that's how many predictions you'd have to do to replicate our study. And, we could easily, dropped a couple of those zeros going to the 1 kilometer or even the 10 kilometer. It's much easier to predict a billion predictions than a trillion predictions. But that, it took us 4 years to scale too. So that is the cost, the time and effort to get that farm scale predictions. And, it's the kind of thing that is well suited for the USGS or government in general. There's 13 years of data collection, 2 years of modeling, 4 years of scaling. That's something that, would be very hard for a university type to pull off. And another decision that we made was to model going all the way up into Canada. We didn't have to do that, but the ecosystem didn't end at the border. It did add a lot of challenges and a lot of pixels, but it did form a really strong relationship with their Canadian colleagues. And they were also running huge projects, and effectively they decided that they don't need to build a methane model because there's already one. And they put their resources towards radiometric dating of carbon, the other part of wetlands where they take CO2 out of the air. So then I was able to allocate less money to radiometric dating. So the two countries, we work together a lot now. We're saving each other hundreds of thousands of dollars in resources. Okay, so we wanted to know how our model compared to global models. I told you why they should be wrong. So we compared it to about 50 top-down and bottom-up models. And you can notice really quick that the spatial pattern is roughly the same, despite completely independent ways to estimate flux and different resolutions. And in 2011, a wet year, we estimated 0.62 teragrams. And although individual global models were 2 to 5 times off, their means and their ensembles, the ensembles of the means or medians of the ensembles were surprisingly close. So this is great. This gives us confidence that our numbers are in the right ballpark, that global models are in the right ballpark. It also means that our model could be used to, calibrate or validate global models. So it's a way that, learning a lot about one location can translate to better estimates, throughout the world. And once we did our trillion predictions, we added them all up to see how much total methane was coming out of the region. And when we looked in the past, either dry years or wet years, overall, we're looking at around 0.5 teragram per year, which is very low compared to the global, wetland methane budget of 250 and plus or minus 100. When we looked into the future, the SSP 4.5 scenario has about a 1.7 degree warming. We're going to see methane emissions go up, even if we go into a dry state into the future. And this is kind of pre-baked in warming that we really can't avoid. And if we go kind of the SSP 8.5 worst case scenario, then we can just expect even more methane, several fold higher, especially if we're in a wet period, which is what we're in right now. And I'm not saying that all wetlands around the world are going to respond the same as PPR wetlands, but it is reasonable to think that at least temperate wetlands will respond similarly, in part because of the dramatic extension of the growing season. All right, so back to this hot mess that we're in. So in recent years, we've actually had some pretty strong international and national initiatives to dramatically cut the amount of methane in the atmosphere. And if we, are able to cut some methane out of the air, that will actually, slow the pace of climate change and give us a chance to deal with CO2. But if pre-baked in warming causes the wetlands to increase, their baseline methane emissions, then we're not going to be able to hit or at least maintain those methane mitigation targets. So this is where the global implications come in, that we really need to account for wetland methane to know how much human methane we need to cut. And it actually gets even more sticky because this extra wetland methane, since it's caused by human-caused warming, could that be considered human-caused methane? It would almost be impossible to distinguish from baseline methane. And then we'd have to ask who's going to put that methane in their nationally defined contributions. Is it the countries with the wetlands or the countries that warm the climate? So these are very sticky issues that still need to be dealt with. So in summary, we can expect increase in methane from at least prairie poplar wetlands. But we did learn that there's ways that wetlands are being managed right now that are inadvertently increasing methane. We know there are ways that we can deliberately decrease methane from farms. I hope you appreciate now why any methane mitigation target really needs to account for not just human emissions, but also natural emissions. And to do any of this, we need better numbers on wetland methane and carbon emissions, because no country in the world right now is reporting their freshwater wetland emissions very well, including the US. So this is what this picture down here represents. It's the USGS led a workshop with the EPA and a whole bunch of other organizations that came together to start, kind of building that roadmap to integrating wetlands into the US national inventory. So that's the end of my methane talk.
Awesome.
Thank
you.
I have a couple of slides on the on this workshop if you want, or we can save that.
Let's save that. If we don't have questions,